Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I am Nick Chase from Mirantis, and welcome to Cloud Native and Coffee. See, we even got coffee cups. See, Cloud Native and Coffee. Uh, I want to welcome you to today's talk. Today's topic is open source reaching a breaking point, and with me here today we have, as usual, Sean O'Mara from Mirantis, our field CTO, and our guest for today is Christofer Dutz, founder and founder, maintainer. What I don't know exactly what you would say your title is of the Apache PLC4X project. Uh,
Hi.
we brought Christofer here today because he has sort of taken a stand on the issue of corporations and support and so on. So we'll get to that as we go along. So let's kind of start out here. Christofer, tell us a bit, sort of, how did you get involved in open source?
Yeah, well, maybe I should mention I started learning Java when I was at the university for the first semester. And it was 1998. And it was sort of like, I remember it was Java 1.0.7. Sort of that sort of a version I'll never forget. But it was also a time when this strange new idea of open source was coming up. So I was sort of amazed that prior to that, you sort of always had to pay loads of money for getting some software, well, or not paying money for getting software. But in the end, it was everything was commercial, and there was this strange open source thing. And I got in touch because I loved XML at the time when it was just the newest stuff that was sort of fresh to market. And there was this Apache Cocoon project that allowed me to do some really amazing Web 2.0 stuff way before the term even was invented. So I started as a typical user, and I think that's been that way ever since. So I'm a big user of open source, but well, as it is, well, you usually come across the one or the other bug or something that's not working as you think it should, or it's missing some features. So I started as sort of like I always call them drive-by committers. So you come by a project, you use it, you see something, you fix something, you submit it, and you move on. So that was how it started for me.
That sounds like a saying. If you see something, fix something.
If you see something, say something. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I think
Totally for the
that
U.S.
has to do
audience.
more
I'm
with
sorry.
espionage or the London Underground than anything else. But
so, so
be a good
I, lo-
byline. If you see something, fix something.
yeah, there you go. Yeah, we should use that. We should use that. Yeah, I love the notion of drive-by committers that you just kind of like lob a change over the fence and see what
Yeah,
happens.
Well, I mean,
So
I think I'd actually have to see statistics about that, but I mean, you probably find that's the vast majority of committers or drive-by committers, and
yeah.
especially in those early days. I mean, I started at about the same time as Christopher, so
God, you guys are making me feel old, man.
yeah.
Oh, you guys are making me feel old.
I'm a little
Eh,
older than Christopher.
and I'm older than you. So there you go.
Now, Nick.
I am. I am. I'm older than you. Anyway, all right. Well, so okay, so you got involved. So you got involved in open source that way. So did you have any particular expectations of how this was going to work?
Yeah, well, if I ran into a bug and I fixed it, well, my expectation was that I wasn't gonna run into that bug anymore because I took care of that. So I think that was sort of like how it really started. And then was this one or the other project which I used heavily, and I submitted a lot of different fixes and started helping out on the mailing lists and stuff like that. And sometimes I even took over development if the original author was sort of like fed up with the project, wanted to go away, do something else. And I always considered this yeah, I know I use a lot of open source, so I'm using stuff other people built, and I was sort of like fine with that, and I just considered investing time in other projects where I knew that I was sort of more skilled or had I could sort of more easily achieve things. So I just considered this my paying into the whole ecosystem. Yeah. So it was my part of sort of like, yeah, everybody's on this big open source party. Everybody brings a bottle of drinks with it. So that was sort of me in the beginning. That was me bringing my bottle to the party.
So your idea was contributing through your own efforts. So because you were consuming other people's open source projects, you felt that you were giving back by contributing as well in your own way. Maybe not to those projects, but to other projects.
Yeah. That changed a bit because when I started this PLC4X project, it was sort of like I wanted to use open source because it was 5 years ago. All of this Industry 4.0, I don't know how it was in the US, but in Germany, it's sort of like everything was full of Industry 4.0, Industry 4.0 everywhere. Everybody was talking about it, but nobody actually knew what it was. But all the use cases they sort of sketched out, they were all sort of very familiar use cases. So if it's sort of like typical use cases you've been using, let's say in banking industry. So detecting sort of anomaly in some payment streams. Well, the difference to detecting an anomaly in some data or sensor streams coming from a production machine, well, there's not much difference. So I knew there's a lot of open source out there that we could do loads of really cool projects in the industry with, but we were all missing this one little piece, this adapter to communicate with the data, with the machines out there. Because, well, big data is great, but if you don't have data, well, big data is sort of like, so meh. But so I thought, well, I started PLC4X with the sort of expectation to create revenue from consulting in that area, because I knew I was opening a market that is just huge. So yeah, that was generally something I did intentionally. I knew there was a need for something like that, and I believed in the potential of it. And yeah, the expectations were really well. First of all, sort of like bringing not just one bottle, a box of beer to the party, but also, yeah, well, I was sort of speculating on some cool drinks from the other side, but yeah.
Out of interest, just diverging for a second here. So when you started PLC4X, I mean, typically the control systems industry has been pretty closed, pretty tight. The big players tend to create closed ecosystems because it's a great way to create lock-in, but as well, if somebody breaks a PLC controller, that can be a very expensive exercise. Never mind a machine can crash, you could probably have, power station meltdown. What was it like introducing open source software into that industry at that time? I mean, 5 years ago, open source is still fairly fresh in many people's minds.
Yeah, well, I think maybe I could two little examples. I remember I was on the Automatica. It's sort of like an automation and robotics fair in Munich, and I was there, and I think it was the booth of. I was talking to this guy because I wanted to talk. I went to all the major vendors and I started talking to them about, yeah, what do you have any specs available? Are they? What do you think about open source? So I was sort of like doing some lobby work, approaching the vendors, and I'll never forget that guy who sort of like, first he was really, really friendly, and then he said, yeah, I'm. He even grabbed my jacket and said, yeah, I'm going to call the police now and stuff like that. So that was interesting. I just yelled at him and said, let me go, because I'm not doing anything illegal or bad, but you just ruined your reputation with me, at least. This was similar in the beginning. The first contacts were, yeah, if you're going to do that, we're going to sue the hell out of you. And And that changed over time. So I'll never forget, I think I was on the Linux Foundation OSS Summit in Edinburgh, and I got a call from somebody from, and he actually asked if they could use the software I wrote and products that uses. So sort of there has been, in the beginning, it was sort of like a pretty rough terrain. But I think they are all sort of starting to get used to the idea.
Mm-hmm. And how is, with that change in their attitude, have they been contributing back into the open source ecosystem?
No. Well, some of them have. Yeah, well, some, if you look behind me, I have this little factory there. I think this device back here, that's from a company called Beckhoff. They provided me with the hardware, or I think Phoenix Contact provided me with other hardware. Yeah, the stuff I've got over here, sort of, they sometimes, the ones I wouldn't call dinosaurs, so the companies that have always sort of like just after mankind sort of evolved from the first puddles, they sort of came up. So those companies, they usually have really big problems sort of grasping this concept of open source. But the younger companies, they tend to be a bit more helpful. I think from Beckhoff, I even got the specs for their protocols and stuff like that. I've got a person on speed dial that I can ask whenever I have a problem. But yeah, well, I wouldn't be expecting that from the Siemens, Schneider, ABB, whatever they're called.
But is that because those companies, those smaller companies, need to do that to be competitive? They need to take advantage of open source, whereas the older companies have already established themselves. They've already sunk the investment into proprietary technologies. You know, they sort of don't feel the pressure to be competitive.
I do think that they're starting to feel that, because the thing is, 5 years ago in the industry, when I went to potential customers, so I didn't just go to the big vendors, so I also went to the people that had a factory and sort of like wanted to do some smart stuff with that. So when I approached them and I was talking about this open source, and they just couldn't imagine, sort of like, so you're working full time on something you're giving away for free? So please explain that. And I think it's natural, because everybody who's in the area of production, well, you produce stuff. It consumes energy. It consumes resources. It consumes it wears down the machinery. So you can't just sort of like duplicate it. So I think this is where usually this misunderstanding is, because with open source, well, I write this once and it takes a certain effort, but I can just duplicate that. Mm-hmm. And so more and more companies using the automation hardware, they've learned to appreciate that sort of open source is, well, they have learned to appreciate that it's free, but also that it's actually way better than they expected. Because in the beginning, I usually heard stuff like, well, if something's for free, it can't be good. Yeah, that's changed too. And I think more and more companies are simply demanding stuff like that. So I think big companies are being forced more and more to sort of switch, and also they're all trying to hire at the moment like crazy. And I think the big ones are really noticing that no sort of IT professional with sort of sane attitude would sort of like crave for working for one of those. They would rather go to any of the other ones where you know, well, yeah, there I can do something. There I'm not sort of like in this corset of sort of corporate policy. Yeah.
It's an interesting thing, and I want to go back to something you were saying. You know, the idea that open source software is free. It's a pet topic of mine, because I say it isn't free. I say it's free to use, but it isn't free.
Yeah.
You know, yes, it is a force multiplier, and I think that's a very important point that you made. Ultimately, you write it once, you maintain it, but you can then reuse it in many places as part of your career. But you still have bills to pay. You've probably got a mortgage or rent, and you've got to feed yourself. How have you been doing that over the years whilst writing and maintaining software full time? I mean, only with what you'd like to share here, but
Yeah, well, I had some luck because I was working for a company called Codecentric, sort of in Germany. It's pretty well known. It's sort of an expert consultancy, and so they had something they called innovation budget, and I applied for that, and it was sort of like a company internal Shark Tank. So you pitch your idea, and if the board likes it, you get funding for half a year. So I managed to get that. So I started to work full time on PLC4X, and the company was so happy with the progress that in the end it was 3.5 years that I was able to work full time on PLC4X. But admittedly, they didn't want to do that for sort of like just being nice and giving back. So they believed in my idea that with PLC4X we would be opening a whole new market that was sort of like just craving for the know-how that we had in the company.
So ultimately, from them, it's an investment in growing a market that they can then tap into. So it's, So come back to it, it's not free.
Yeah. So that sort of switched. So it was in the year 2020. Well, I know a lot of bad stuff happened in 2020, but that was also the year when I was cut off from this innovation budget. So I managed to get some half a year of funding from sort of European research funds via the NLNet initiative. That sort of like kept me going on PLC4X for another half a year. So I was planning on going. So I left Codecentric, did that research project, and I was planning on doing typical consulting. So I just thought, well, with a few gigs per month or so, I'd be able to survive. But well, then the second or third wave of COVID hit. Everybody was just closing their purses again, and at that time I joined Mapped. Because that company, that was now a complete different facet of open source. Yeah, with Codecentric, it was creating a new market for consulting services, but with Map, it was something different. Map needed to access data in building automation, but they didn't want to. So they didn't want to sell drivers for building automation. So sort of this driver that sort of exists was just something they needed to do their job. And I think that's how most committers in the PLC4X project joined. They were usually from companies that didn't want to sell drivers for communicating with industrial hardware, but they just needed something to communicate with this device that they had there. So they started contributing. So open source is not only sort of the free software is what everybody gets, but for me it's more the way of sharing the work, of creating something that everybody needs, but nobody has sort of like as it's not the core business of the company.
Yeah.
And let's kind of be clear here, because what we're kind of exposing is the dirty little secret of open source, which is, well, everybody thinks of it as everybody contributing out of the goodness of their heart because it's a cool project and it's lots of fun.
It is fun.
Well, it is fun. It is fun. Don't get me wrong. It is fun. Drive-by committers are great. It's terrific to create a project on your own and scratch your own itch, as they say. Most major projects are supported by people who work for companies who are benefiting from the software.
Yeah.
I mean, I often make that statement is people coming on and scratching their own itch. A huge part of open source is that. I mean, massive projects and small projects, contributors inevitably, if they're not fixing bugs, are scratching an itch that they need to solve, and it gives them the opportunity to focus on that very small itch rather than having to scratch the whole surface of their body. But this analogy is going too far. But I think you understand what I'm getting at, and I think that's one of the beauties of open source. But one of also the dangers is because people come along and do scratch their own itch, but nobody else has the same itch, and then it becomes difficult to maintain sometimes.
Right. And then we run into a situation where, well, what happens when what happens when you do have someone who is working on something that is not supported by any particular company? And
Yeah.
that's where we run into the
Correct.
situation. So explain to us what the situation is now.
Yeah, well, the situation was when I joined Mapped and I started. So I continued working full time on PLC4X, but I wasn't able to fully concentrate on the most important part of the project, because at Apache we always say community over code. So a great code base with only one maintainer is way less sustainable than, let's say, a not quite as perfect code base, but with a healthy community around it. So I knew that I had to keep on pushing the community side of the project. So I was doing my full day job. But after hours, I was doing sort of like writing board reports. Well, that's not that much work, but I was committing, I was fixing bugs people were reporting. I was mentoring people that wanted to start contributing. I was doing all sorts of stuff, especially also implementing features that I thought the industry would be needing. Well, and obviously they were needing them, because I still believed in this idea of sort of earning a living with working on this project. Yeah.
That's a great question I wanted to ask, is how much of your personal time outside of working hours, so typical 8 till 4, 8 till 5, were you putting into this project?
I would say at least another 40 to 50 hours per week.
Wow.
Yeah, so that was crazy. Sort of, it was a crazy year anyway. Sort of like, yeah, well, in Germany we had a particularly really crappy summer, so it was sort of like, it just felt like it was just raining the entire summer. So the whole world was burning. Germany was drowning. So going outside is no fun. So I was coding, but till the end of the year, I really did notice that if you sort of like just work through a full year with 80 to 90 hours per week, well, it does sort of leave the mark on you. And especially, as you can see behind me, I've got all this hardware, and I need to buy this hardware because writing drivers to communicate with hardware really works bad if you don't have the hardware to talk to. So usually, if I wanted to create a new driver, I had to purchase the hardware for that. Mostly, I also had to buy the software to set it up. So I had expenses, but I didn't have any sort of real income coming in. So I think in 2020, I had one paid consulting gig where a company from Spain called Zulk, they financed the initial work on the Profinet driver. But the thing is, if you're sort of, you're buying stuff in order to create stuff for free, and yeah, well, you're running your company at a deficit. And well, especially in Germany, the tax officials don't like people running businesses at a deficit for a long time. So I really did have some unfortunate or unpleasant discussions with them. I managed to sort of like, yeah, it's going to be a black number this year, so I'm not going to be in a deficit. But if I think of how much time I put into this, to seeing what I'm getting out, sort of that I'm praying that it's going to be sort of not a negative number, it just felt bad at the end of the year, especially as everybody was sort of like shouting out, hey, it's pandemic times and we still got record revenues. And I knew, yeah, for you guys, I fixed 3 bugs this year. So I just felt, I was burnt out, and I was like just mad at sort of like, yeah, keep on yelling out how much money you've saved, how much revenue you've won. Yeah, I won't drink a beer on you because yeah, I just can't afford it from the money that I got from you.
Oh, excuse me. So you made a decision.
Yeah.
Tell us about your decision.
Yeah, well, my decision was simply that I will stop providing free community support. So whenever a company, well, with PLC4X, it's usually a company that has an issue, even if the email usually comes from some private AOL. I think in my blog post I said AOL. I think I haven't seen an AOL email for quite some time, but usually those cheap Apple or Google email addresses where you hear, yeah, well, I'm working for this huge steel melting plant, and we've got this tiny little issue. So I just said, yeah, I'm going to stop doing this. I'm still helping people fix issues, scratch their issues themselves. So I'm mentoring people fix their own issues. But I've just said, yeah, I'm just not gonna continue investing my free time to fix stuff that they get their job done better, and they're not even willing to give anything back.
So what should they do? So what should they be doing? In an ideal world, they would be doing what?
Yeah, well, behind open source projects, and it's not just behind PLC4X, behind every open source project, there are people. They're doing their job, they're working. If a project that you're using is important for your company, just think about sort of supporting the people behind the projects. I mean, behind every bit bigger project, there's usually a few companies that are willing to provide commercial support, training, feature development, and stuff like that. So just people should start thinking about what happens to a project if you don't support it at all, if you just keep on consuming. I mean, that Faker.js guy, yeah, he's actively sabotaged his project. Well, I'd never do that, but I have to admit, I can sort of understand the guy.
We should let me hold that thought for a second, because let us explain exactly what happened. So the gentleman who runs Faker.js and I think Colors.js got so frustrated at the fact that people were not supporting the open source projects that were being used by many commercial projects, including the AWS SDK, that and not supporting it, that he basically said, screw this, and corrupted the NPMs so that when people updated to the latest version, it essentially broke all of this stuff. And his point was, hey, you know what? If this was so worthless to you, why is all your stuff broken?
Yeah.
Really extreme way of dealing with it, but I do.
It is an extreme way of dealing with it. We're not condoning that.
No,
we're not condoning that. It was bad developer, no cookie.
So since you made your announcement, Chris, what has been the reaction from these industry players? I mean, again, this is a unique industry, so has there been any reaction?
Yeah. So I should have mentioned. So when I posted that blog post on a Tuesday, and 2 days later I was sort of like, I just decided, yeah, I just need a break. So I called my boss. They gave me PTO. I got in my car, grabbed my snowboard, and went snowboarding. And on Thursday, I was sitting in a nice sort of cabin going up the hill with my board, and my phone told me, yeah, Google said, yeah, well, your name is sort of trending. And so I just, oh, gee, what's going on now? So I had a look, and I saw that newspapers or IT blogs all over the planet were reporting, sort of picked up my blog post. So I was expecting my social media bubble to read that, maybe for the one or the other to forward that to the one or the other guy from a company that might be an investor, but I wasn't expecting it to sort of like go through the world like a wildfire. Yeah, I've had a lot of people contact me from all sorts of businesses. A lot of them even really started asking questions of how they could actively contribute, sort of not just sort of like investing money, but also contributing to the project. Because I think a lot of people didn't even think about that detail. They were just so used to consuming software because they've never been doing anything else, that maybe that blog post woke up the one or the other person.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So what's your take on providing or building an organization to provide commercial support for open source software?
Yeah, well, it's definitely something that's very important, and that was also the reason why when I joined Mapped, I sort of insisted, or so I strongly asked for being able to continue my business as a side thing, because I knew if somebody really wanted to use the software and there would be no support at all, well, the thing is gone. In the PLC4X project, we've sort of even formed, let's say, sort of an alliance with all with many contributors to the project under industrial-opensource.com. We're sort of like trying to provide commercial support offerings, but not from a single company, but sort of like from many companies that sort of provide this sort of like as a proxy, let's say.
Interesting. Okay.
And that's and that is the supposed strength of open source, is that you have these communities. When you have a healthy project,
Yeah.
as you say, community over code, there are multiple avenues for getting support, as long as the community itself is getting that support.
And what I also think is really interesting, because in the beginning, when I was talking to people in the industry, they all asked about, well, commercial support. I get commercial support from my major vendor here. But when you start asking them, what does that actually mean? And usually they said, yeah, well, if I report a bug, well, it's fixed. And then you start asking, so how long does it take till it gets fixed? And so usually if you've got basic support, like you've bought the software and you don't have a support contract, well, you are free to add issues to a bug database for free usually, but you can expect it to be fixed in at least a year or two, because release cycles in the automation industry, they're just crazy. And but if sort of like your factory is currently on fire on a Sunday and you want somebody to fix that, well, then you have to pay insane amounts of money. I think it's big 6-digit numbers that you have to pay to get somebody from one of the major vendors to get into office, fix your problem, and give you a solution immediately. I have to say, well, if somebody gave me that 6-digit number, I'd also be willing to do 24/7 support. I'd definitely get up at night for that.
Very true. So I mean, so what do you recommend? So what it sounds like what you're recommending is that companies sort of be proactive and say, hey, look, this is the open source software that we use. We should look into setting up support contracts, just so that we're covered. We're covered. B, we're supporting the industry that is supporting us.
Yeah. Well, there are more ways you can contribute. For example, you can sort of like a lot of the bigger projects, they joined one of the many open source foundations. So it's also possible. So if you think just say you went through your products and you noticed, oh, there's a lot of Apache stuff there. So, but not really something where I could say, oh, well, I want to support this project with this amount and this project with that amount. But if you feel that you want to give something back, well, you can also just sponsor one of the foundations out there. That's always money that's put to good use. Of course, if sort of you're working on one of the smaller projects that nobody considers sort of like, yeah, that's really essential. Like, let's say, the Apache Commons project. I think there's not a single phone or TV or whatever out there that doesn't have anything from that project in there. So it really does help sort of like build a list, what you're using, how important that is for you, and then maybe just consider reaching out to the community, asking how you can contribute. Sometimes they just say, oh, well, we're fine. I think I've contacted 2 or 3 open source projects myself because I was relying on their work for my work. So I contacted them and said, how can I give back to you? Do you have a Patreon account? Do you have anything? Sometimes I don't even get a response. Some even said, oh, well, I'm just doing that for fun. That you're happy makes me happy. So there are people like that. But there are other ones that say, well, we could need help with testing. We could need help with just hands-on work. Join in the project. Or, well, sponsor us because I'm currently sort of like struggling to survive, and I might have to take up a sort of like 9-to-5 job at some bank just to pay the bills. So yeah, I think there are multiple ways.
I think ultimately that there are at least 4 tiers of players involved in this. They're the consumers, they're the companies that are commercializing open source software and should be contributing back as part of that commercialization process. There are the foundations that are shepherding and helping and structuring, everything from OpenInfra to Apache and others. And then there are the contributors. And there has to be a flow of resources between those different layers. And we need to be more open about where that flow is coming from and make sure that at each layer is both being upheld to a standard. So, when you're consuming it, understand that it isn't free. When you're supporting it, and when you're commercializing open source, you need to prove that you are also contributing back, because just commercializing it without contributing is, I think, also very much on the wrong end of this spectrum here.
Or at the very least, contribute back to the open source ecosystem in general.
Yes, but I feel strongly, and I mean, this is my opinion, but I feel strongly that if you are commercializing a specific piece of open source code,
yes, true.
then you very much need to be contributing back to that open source. Because otherwise, how can you claim that you can provide support for a piece of software that you have a connection to the community to?
Yeah. That's
unrealistic.
By the way, if anybody has any questions, please go ahead and drop them in the chat. We'll try and work them into the conversation.
So Christofer, if you were going to do this again, if you could go back to 1998 or 5 years ago when you started, what would you do differently?
I think one thing that I did wrong in the beginning was that I sort of entered this market and tried to convince people based on proven facts. And it was, so I was confronted.
That we're all laughing about that. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was confronted. So I was hesitant to sort of like put out claims that about problems that I was solving and how good we were at solving them, if I couldn't sort of like rock solid prove them. But I was sort of like facing marketing campaigns, multi-million marketing campaigns from all different sides of automation industry vendors. And clearly what they were claiming, it was sort of like it was just fake news most of the time. And it took about 2 years for people to actually realize that. So I think I should have probably sort of been a bit more proactive about what we're planning on doing or what we will be able to do, and not just concentrate on what we can do right now. But I think I would still I would start the project again because I still believe it is important. I would probably approach customers a bit differently, but yeah.
Okay.
Cool. And any message that you want to put out there? Anything you want to share with the audience here today that you think was important for us to understand about the open source community or where you're going?
Well, I'd like to encourage everybody to participate in open source, because most people think that you're giving more than you're receiving. And even if I sort of like wasn't directly receiving stuff for my work on PLC4X, you still should consider yeah, I've got a good job. I don't have a problem with finding a new job if I would be losing my job. It's also a lot of fun, I have to admit, just hanging. When we go to these open source conferences, especially the ones at the Apache Software Foundation, I really enjoy just traveling the world, hanging out with people that are sort of like-minded, seeing places on Earth that I wouldn't have been able to see without. So I still think that working for open source isn't just giving. You're getting a lot back. You're not getting a lot back in pure money, but there is a lot of free beer involved. I should mention that. So I think I've had a free beer on every continent of this Earth because of my open source involvement. But yeah, it's sort of, it makes me feel good if I sort of solved somebody other's problem. Well, this sort of joy has been sort of like damped a bit by sort of like the industry. But in general, if I'm not only working on PLC4X. I think at Apache, I think I'm a committer in 12 different projects. I think in total, I'm a committer in something near 20 to 25 projects where I've got commit rights because I've just contributed. So I'm still doing a lot of stuff outside of PLC4X, and whenever I solve a problem that somebody else was struggling with, I really enjoy that feeling.
Cool.
So, all right. So I'm going to have to ask the question that gets us back to the title here. While we hope people put questions, and we've got at least one question in the chat, but now's the time to put them in. So let's bring us back to the beginning. Based on what you guys have seen, do you think that open source is reaching a breaking point?
I would say not sort of like the entire open source sort of like breaking, but I'm seeing more and more people in open source sort of struggling and sort of like just sort of at the brink of giving up. But I also see that the adoption, especially in this industrial automation sector, I do see that more and more awareness is coming. So I think there are two sides. I think on the one side, there's a breaking point where I do think the industry is finally understanding to appreciate and to know how to work with open source. But if I was to decide, I definitely say they should do it a bit faster, that there is not too much collateral damage on the way.
Mm-hmm.
Right. I mean, the risk of working with an open source, what would you consider the risk of working with an open source project?
Yeah, well, the risks most people say are, I don't get support. You have the risk of sort of the maintainer sort of like dropping the project. You have the risk of, well, there being a bug in there. But to all these risks, I really have to say, so you can mitigate all of them because, yes, there is commercial support if you support the companies offering commercial support. So if you don't support those companies, they will give up, and then you don't have commercial support.
Exactly.
If you yes, there will be bugs, but I have to admit, I've been using some industry standard engineering software, and sort of like the bugs people have been complaining about in open source. Well, that's just sort of crazy that people from the automation industry would only start complaining about that. Yeah, just imagine those PLCs back there. I'd say at least 50% of them are absolute state-of-the-art devices. And all of them are state-of-the-art devices, but about 50% have absolutely no measures of preventing malicious people from tampering with them.
Yeah. So just because it's not open source doesn't mean there's no risk.
No, definitely. And the thing is, if you decide to,
doesn't exist. So
yeah. So right. if you've got a major vendor and yeah, you get support, but it's brutally expensive. You don't even really can say if it get fixed instantly. If the company drops the product, well, you're lost. With open source, well, if the community leaves, well, at least you have the chance to continue working with it.
Exactly. So, all right. So basically, any risks can be mitigated, which is not something that you can necessarily say for non-open source.
Right.
Okay. So let us open up to questions here. We do have a question. I will say I'm not 100% clear on the point that this person is trying to make. So I'm just going to read through this, and you guys can interpret it as you like. The core, who pays? As designer of the upcoming EU-NATO cyber defense, I started with the design of an intelligent backbone software protocol in order to reach the end user. Now EU and NATO governments are using Docker and Kubernetes for free based on my recommendations. By the way, built a model myself, supercomputing.dk. At least as designer, I've seen no pay, although all papers were stamped IPR and copyrights belongs to me. I think I have to start my own channel, smiley face. Okay, let's just kind of like pick this apart. Presumably, this gentleman got paid to create this design. I'm not sure why they would pick up a free cyber defense. If you're out there, please clarify for us. And also, presumably, these governments are paying someone to support their Docker and Kubernetes implementations.
Well, I think what I'm reading here, Nick, is the core question is he's asking who pays, who should be paying.
Okay.
Where is the source of the money? I think it's something we did discuss a little bit when we talked about the 4 tiers and how the contribution cycle should work. I mean,
yeah. Well, maybe if it's sort of like EU, NATO, usually these or institutions have forms of sort of research funds or funding stuff. So that half a year that I was working on the porting PLC4X to the language C, that was mainly for an initiative for securing communication with industrial hardware. So that was an EU-funded research fund for securing industrial communication.
Okay. Yeah, he says no pay. I'm not sure exactly how that worked. Maybe go ahead and contact us, and maybe we'll have you on as a guest one day. We can figure this out. All right. So I'm going to ask. We have no other questions, so we're going to give it a minute for anyone else to submit anything, and then we can start wrapping up.
Well, whilst we're doing that, Christofer, so what's next for you? What's the next big project in your future?
Yeah, well, I'm still working hard on sort of like implementing the stuff that we need for MAP, because we're building a really awesome product that sort of is using the information that we're collecting from sort of industrial and sort of like building automation in general. So yeah, for me, nothing has really changed. I will have more free time. So I really hope that we're going to have a good summer this year, because I'm really planning on using it. So that's generally what's going to change. Yeah. So I'm going to be continuing to push the project. I'm going to be continuing to work on it, but I just won't sort of like do it as intensely as I did it last year.
And if you look at this industry, I mean, if you're willing to make a prediction about, we're talking about industrial programmable logic and industrial IoT here a lot. Where do you think we're going with this? Do you think the technologies are going to change and be more open sourced?
I would say that just judging from the feedback I got from my blog post, and I found one thing really, really interesting. So the feedback was from German and European companies, was sort of like, come on, let us try this one little use case here and try it out. the US guys, they were more sort of like, can I buy you? Do you want to move? Sort of, we want to go all in. It's sort of like, yeah, not gonna happen. Yeah, but it was sort of like, it just felt like sort of the Europeans were sort of like putting their big toe into the pond, trying to see, oh, is it warm or is it cold? And it felt like in the US, the industry is sort of more ready to sort of like just run and just jump into the pool and try it out. So I found that really, really interesting.
Yeah, the conservatism of European companies versus the British.
Especially Germans. We're really good at being conservative with that.
Yeah, it's what we Americans do. We run and we jump into the pool, and hopefully there's water in it.
I was just going to say, assume that there's water.
Yeah, and enough water.
And enough water. It's true. We did have a new question, which is your crowdfunding working as of now? How are your expectations?
Yeah, the crowdfunding is absolutely not working at all. But I have to sort of clarify that a bit. So the amounts that have been sort of displayed, I think it's $150 or something like that on all campaigns. That was actually test data. I just decided to sort of leave it in there. So there hasn't been a single donation going into any of these crowdfunding things. But I still wouldn't call it a loss, because I think it's also something I would suggest other open source projects do, because actually naming things that could be done and attaching a price tag to it sort of makes this idea of contributing way less abstract for companies. So there are currently 2 companies that are thinking of, two of how already sort of signed an agreement that they will be partially funding some of them, some of the crowdfunding projects that I have there. But admittedly, when I started the platform, I knew something based on donations won't work, because donations don't work well with corporate expenses. Yes. But the reason why I didn't do it as a real crowdfunding platform, that was probably a really German reason, because that was interesting. So setting up a crowdfunding platform, that's no problem at all. But the stupid thing in Germany is, if it's typical crowdfunding and you have to pay back if it doesn't get funded, well, you have to pay interest on that. That's sort of like German law. So, and now you're paying interest. That means you have sort of a bank-like sort of service, and then you have to be accredited by the BaFin, and you have to do an insane paper trail. So that's why I decided to sort of go this funding way, because this way I don't have any problems with doing this. But there are companies willing to invest time and money into funding these crowdfunding initiatives, but sort of like more on a corporate way.
Okay. Well, that's good.
Yeah. The joys of living in Germany and the bureaucracy that we have to deal with.
Yeah. Well, when I had a lawyer check this before I started, because I knew, gee, I don't want to sort of like be sued the hell out of me as soon as I go online with this. And he said, yeah, well, for this reason and that reason. I just thought, oh, gee, Germany.
See, just go jump in the pool, man.
Yeah.